Hello and thank you for joining. In this tutorial I will show you how to write a custom function for a directive workflow, and I will show you a workflow where we will use that function, and I've prepared this workflow for this tutorial. I'll go through this workflow to explain to you what it does and where we are using our service, and then I'll show you the service and how to actually write it and deploy it. So maybe in previous sessions, or if you have joined previous sessions, you've seen the basic structure of a directive workflow. There is functions part where you define the functions you want to use within your workflow. In this case, we want to use something with an ID my name service, which is using that Docker image. This is one uploaded to a local repository. The type is Knative workflow, which means it's only used within that workflow, and it's always available. In this case, there's always like one instance running. The workflow itself is pretty simple. Just a few states, and to show you what what a custom function can do. The first state is a validate state, which is basically it's just to make sure that the workflow is getting the right input. That's a state in Directive which is usually used at the beginning of the workflow. In this case, we want to make sure that there is attribute coming in, or property called name. And once the workflow passes this state, it transitions into the greeter state, which is an action state, and it's using our custom function. In directive action state, you provide inputs, or you can provide inputs to the actions, which can be static values, but it can basically get information from the workflow state and pass it into the action as well. For example, in this case, we are taking with JQ the name provided when calling the service and pass it in as a variable name. So this will basically translate into JSON object with an attribute name with whatever we provided as an attribute name when we started this workflow. After calling this action, we will transition into the finish state, which is a no-op state. So basically it does really nothing. It only logs something, and it returns, there's a little bit of a transform, it returns what the service has returned. To show you error handling within the custom function, we are doing an error handling or catching an error as well in the greeter state. So if there's an error thrown from that custom function called greeter.shortName, then we transition into a state called longer, which is that state, which does also a transform. And as an example, in this case it's JavaScript, which just grabs the name, repeats it 5 times, and then transitions into the greeter state again, which will then finish successfully. I can show you this workflow in the editor as well. We have the validate state, it calls the action state. In case of an error, it goes into this longer state, and then eventually in the finish state, and the workflow has finished. But let's have a look how that custom function looks like. Okay, so let's look at the function we have used in this workflow example. But first I want to show you where you can get the information how to write your custom function, or a little bit more. And it's on our documentation page, docs.directive.io, getting started and making custom functions. This is, not a surprise, a very short section because there's really not much to it. A few important things. Your service or function needs to listen to port 8080. It needs to accept JSON as input data. But now you're asking, where does the data come from? And in an action state in Directive, you have this input section where you basically can provide the information that your service or function needs. It can be key value pairs, it can be like complex object, nested object, it can be whatever you want it to be. And this is basically converted into JSON and then sent to the function. In this case, we are saying there is a JSON attribute name with the value which has been provided to this workflow. For example, if it's default, it's Michael, then this would be name Michael, and this will be sent as a JSON object to your function. And again, it can be whatever you want it to be. It can be static values or dynamic ones with JQ. Then there's output data. So whatever your function returns is going back into the state of the workflow. We look at this later when we run it again. And then you can decide if you want to use everything returned by the service, or you can pick certain like parts of it, or you can transform what coming back from the service, and then this will stay in the workflow state. Another important part is reporting errors. You can throw custom errors from your function. It's pretty easy. So your service listens to port 8080 and responds with JSON data. If you want to report an error back to Directive, you just need to set two headers. One is the error code and one is the error message. And if the workflow is not handling it, the workflow ends right there, and it will tell the user that it failed because of this error. Or, like in our case, we are catching it and we are handling it. But this is, again, depends on the workflow. And yeah, then the last thing is we have logging. So to make text or logs appear in that view as logs, there are multiple ways. As you could see in that workflow, we have these log lines and they appear in the logs. But if you want to log from your function, you can post what you want to log to this URL. And how that works is when your function is getting called, we are using Knative to start a pod, and the sidecar is a Directive sidecar, which listens to that to port 889 for your logs. So you log it, you provide the action ID and what you want to log, and then it's getting stored in Directive and then printed to the screen. So let's look at that Python file we used to do this name service. It's a little example based on Fast API. I'm assuming a few of you have used it already. And it has a report error function. And what I said, it's a little function which just sets the two headers and then responds. Then we have a log function which takes the message and logs to that URL, to the sidecar. And then we have the function itself, which extracts the action ID and then logs what the data coming in, and it checks if the name is more than 5 characters, and if it's not, it throws the greeter short name error, which is exactly this one we are catching here. And if not, it just responds with hello and the name you have provided or the workflow has provided. And if the name is completely missing, it throws a greeter missing error. But that should not happen because, as we showed in the first part in the flow, it makes sure with the required tag that this has a name attribute. To build it, it's pretty simple. You just do the normal docker build and docker push. And the Docker file is pretty simple too. It uses a fast API container from Docker Hub. It installs requests. It copies our main file in there. It sets the bind host and the listening port, and that's it. And once you've pushed it, you can see it's green. It's up and running. Application startup complete. There's one instance running, and then you can run it. And to show you this, the error handling, for example, that's my name. So you do this, and you run it, and you can see it went from input to greeter to longer to greeter again, and then to finish, and the response is 5 times my name. After we've seen how easy it is to write your custom functions for Directive, I want to show you a different way to do that. In particular, if you are not familiar with like programming languages, or you just need a quick solution where there's already an existing Linux command line tool doing that, or providing that functionality, things like that. For this, we have written this service builder, which isn't released yet, but it's already available on GitHub. So you can go to GitHub, github.com, Directive Service Builder, and have a look. Again, it's in the latest stages of like testing. It should be ready to go. This one is a source code generator. So based on a configuration file, it generates that directive service for you. It comes as a Docker container, so it's actually simple to use. You first have to init your service. Oop. And this one generates a few files. One is a Docker file, which we'll talk about later. The other one is a run.sh file for testing that service, and the last one, that's the most important part, is it's a swagger.yaml file. It follows the Swagger specification. It has a few additional attributes, starting with x-directive. A few of them are for documentation purposes only, so you can generate documentation too, so other people or other users can use your service in flows as well. But in this presentation, we'll focus on actually the command we are running, which is under this x-directive part. Here you can define commands you want to run, and this code generator will write the source code around it and will execute them. That can be like single commands, it can be for each loops over commands, it can be HTTP request, or a for each over with HTTP requests. In this case, we will just do a simple command. And how it behaves is if your command returns JSON, that will be used as a response, and if not, that will be used as string. There are other ways to change the output too, but that is like too much for this presentation. So we will just do a single command, and we're trying kind of to mimic what we did with the Python example we just did. So we're running one command, which is an echo, and we want to return JSON directly. So here we go, that's JSON. Right, and we're doing message. What this code generation tool does is not only can execute commands, it can use templating too. So you define what the service can take as input, For example, in this case, again, name. That's what we did with Python 1.2. And you can use those as templating variables. So if you do double curly, which says this is now templating, and you want to use a name. So what this command will do is basically running this echo command as if you would run it on a Linux shell. And let's do a second command just to show the concept. Exec, just an ls. Okay, that's it. So to just generate the code, we just do gen. That, as you can see, will create a lot of Go code. Again, it's we're using Go Swagger here. Check them out on GitHub. Pretty awesome project. Yeah, now it's all done. And as I said, the Docker file you can change to whatever you want, except the last 3 lines. So if you are, you can use a Python image, you can use a Node.js image, or whatever. And then you have this little run file to test, which we'll use right now. This will build and run the Docker container for testing when you are in development, to test if that thing does what you think or what it should do. So this is, again, this UI is provided by Go Swagger automatically. So you can look at this stuff and you can do try out. These directive action ID and the temp dir are provided by Directive, so usually you don't really care about this. And you do this, and then let's execute that thing. And as you can see, here's the result. It's an array with 2 results. One is the LA result, and as I said, it's not JSON, so if it's not JSON, it will just like be a string. And the second one is my message with my input. So that looks good. So we can push that. So Docker build hello, and then we push it. And then I always forget this little dot. So now it's available. Let's copy this and use it in a workflow. So let's create a new one with the action template. Say hello. Let's go. Okay, so we want to change that image to the one we've just created. The reusable is the old wording. We're using Knative workflow these days, and we save that, and then we're doing the input. Before we did it dynamically, now we're doing it statically, so we're just sending my name in, save it, and then we run it. As you can see, it takes a little bit longer because the first time it runs, it pulls the image from the local repository, creates a pod, and then runs the command. Now it's done. And you can see it's exactly what we had before, right? And you see that the pod is up and running with our new function, and it's healthy. But let's look at the outcome of this one and make it a little bit nicer. So we can do transforms in action too, in every state. So we do transform, and we do this jq.return. The second command, that should work. Yes, and then we're doing result. Let's change it to hello result and message. Here we go. There it is. You see, this is pretty much the same functionality as the previous workflow, and yeah, hopefully you have now an idea how to provide custom functions to Directive.